The backyard buzzed with the sounds of chatter and laughter as children ran barefoot across the grass, their joyful squeals blending with the sizzle of the barbecue. The family reunion was in full swing, and Jason found comfort in the familiar chaos. He stood at the grill, carefully flipping the burgers, his face warmed by the fire and the late summer sun. "Jason, you're burning them," a voice teased from behind. It was his cousin Grace, grinning while holding a plate of potato salad. Jason laughed. "Never. These are Dad's famous slow-cooked burgers. They need time." Grace shook her head, smiling. "Well, if they taste as good as they smell, I'm not worried." Jason wiped his hands on a dish towel, glancing over at Amber, who was a few feet away laughing with their cousins. She wore a sundress, her golden hair catching the light as she threw her head back, her laughter infectious. A soft smile played on Jason's lips. She was radiant, as always. "Hey, babe," Jason called out, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "Want a beer?" Amber glanced over her shoulder, her smile still intact as she raised her nearly empty wine glass, her eyes slightly glassy from the alcohol. "No, I'm good with this," she said, turning back to her group. Jason shrugged, returning his focus to the grill. He didn't mind. Amber was always the life of the party, and she deserved to unwind. After all, the reunion was their one time of the year to relax. He nudged a steak on the grill, savoring the aroma of sizzling meat. Derek, whiskey glass in hand and, steps a bit unsteady, wandered over. Jason's younger brother was already on his third or fourth drink, but Jason didn't think much of it. Derek had always been the wild one, loud, charismatic, and forever pushing boundaries. "Man, these burgers are worth the drive alone," Derek said, clapping Jason on the back, his speech slightly slurred. Jason chuckled, adjusting his spatula. "Only the best for the reunion. It's Dad's recipe. Remember how he used to fuss over getting the timing just right?" Derek smirked. "Dad and his obsession with perfection. You're the only one who ever took it seriously." Jason smiled, though a hint of tension lingered between them. They had drifted apart in recent years, but at family events they pretended everything was fine. "I try to make him proud," Jason said quietly. Derek took a long sip of his drink, his eyes distant for a moment before his usual smirk reappeared. "Yeah, you do. But don't let it go to your head. You're only good at a few things, man." Jason rolled his eyes, the familiar banter easing some of the tension. "That's rich coming from the guy who barely graduated college." Derek let out a loud laugh, drawing a few glances from nearby relatives. "Hey, I made it, didn't I? Besides, I'm doing fine now." Jason looked around, taking in the scene: kids racing to the big oak tree at the yard's edge, Grace chatting with aunts setting up the dessert table, and the older men deeply engrossed in a football discussion. It was a scene filled with warmth, family, and peace, but an edge of unease tugged at Jason's thoughts. Maybe it was the stress of hosting or the subtle cracks he had noticed in his relationship with Amber lately. They had been married for 10 years, and though everything seemed fine on the surface, something felt off. Amber seemed distant, her smiles were more strained, her touch less frequent. He brushed off the thought as Amber approached, her smile bright as she looped her arm through his. "The grill master hard at work," she teased, peeking at the burgers. "You've really outdone yourself this year." Jason grinned. "I aim to please." Amber leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I was thinking maybe after everyone leaves, we could." Jason's brother, Derek, interrupted, slinging an arm around Jason's shoulders, his whiskey glass dangerously close to spilling. "You're not going to believe what happened at work the other day." Jason shot Amber an apologetic look as Derek launched into a long-winded story. Amber's smile faltered slightly, but she waved it off, stepping back. "I'll leave you boys to it," she said lightly, though Jason noticed a flicker of annoyance in her eyes as she walked away. "Derek, you couldn't have waited 5 minutes," Jason muttered, trying to hide his irritation. Derek, oblivious, continued his tale, gesturing wildly with his glass. "So then I tell the guy, no way you're getting that done by Friday, and he's all." Jason nodded absently, his eyes tracking Amber as she rejoined her friends. She was laughing again, but Jason felt the distance between them more acutely. He sighed, turning back to his brother. As the evening wore on, Jason mingled with family, keeping an eye on the food. He and Amber exchanged polite smiles and brief touches, but the growing sense of unease was hard to ignore. Derek, now visibly drunk, was becoming more animated, making off color jokes and stumbling over his words. At one point, Jason spotted Amber and Derek whispering near the drinks table, Derek's hand lingering on her back a moment too long. Jason frowned, a twinge of discomfort rising, but he shook it off. This was his brother, His family, they were just having fun. "Jason, these steaks are amazing," his uncle called out, pulling him back to the grill. Jason forced a smile, his unease simmering beneath the surface. As night fell, the family gathered around the bonfire. Jason sat next to Amber, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. For a moment, he felt the warmth of the fire and the comfort of family, and the earlier tension faded. Amber leaned into him, her voice soft in his ear. "It's a perfect evening, isn't it?" Jason nodded, relaxing. "Yeah, it is," but as he glanced across the fire and caught Derek watching them, the sense of unease returned, sharper this time. Derek quickly looked away, but something in his expression sent a chill down Jason's spine. He didn't realize it then, but that fleeting look marked the start of a storm that would soon upend his world. The fire crackled softly as the family gathered, the last light of day fading into night. The atmosphere was warm, cozy, filled with the scent of burning wood and the sound of marshmallows roasting over the flames. Jason leaned back, his arm draped around Amber's shoulders. It had been a long, satisfying day filled with food, laughter, and memories. The familiar faces and relaxed smiles of his family made him feel content. This was the life he had always wanted. Amber leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. She had been drinking more than usual tonight, but Jason didn't mind. It was a celebration, and she deserved to unwind. He refilled her wine glass, smiling as she giggled and took a sip. The firelight flickered across their faces, casting long shadows. Jason looked around at the familiar faces, feeling a wave of family warmth. Grace was sharing a funny story about a work meeting, leaving the group in stitches. Derek, sitting across the fire, laughed along, though his laughter sounded forced. Jason barely noticed the tension on his brother's face, chalking it up to the alcohol. Derek often drank too much at these gatherings. It was a common occurrence for everyone. He brushed it off as nothing. Suddenly, Amber's voice cut through the casual conversation, louder than usual. Jason turned to her, surprised. Her cheeks were flushed from the wine, and she wobbled slightly as she stood. "Amber, sit down. You're going to fall," Jason said gently, reaching to steady her. However, she pulled away, swaying as she lifted her glass. "I've got something to say," she announced, her voice louder, tinged with slurs. The group fell silent, a few chuckles echoing as they assumed she was about to make a drunken joke. Jason's brow furrowed, a sense of dread settling in his stomach. He glanced at Derek, whose face had turned pale, his hands tightly gripping his whiskey glass, knuckles white. Amber took a deep breath, gazing around at the gathered family, swaying but not sitting down. Jason's confusion deepened. Why was she behaving so strangely? "I've been sleeping with Derek's brother for 5 years," she slurred, her voice slicing through the warm night like a knife. Silence followed as her words hung in the air, and Jason's mind blanked, trying to grasp what she had said. He blinked, struggling to process. There had to be a mistake. "What the hell?" he whispered, barely able to form the words, his heart thumping and ears ringing. "I've been screwing your brother," Amber repeated, louder, her voice carrying over the fire. For 5 years the air seemed to disappear from Jason's lungs. He felt like he'd been punched. His eyes shifted to Derek, who was staring at the ground, avoiding his gaze. The truth was evident in Derek's guilty expression. Conversations stopped abruptly, laughter died, and everyone stared at Amber, then Jason, weighed down by her words. Amber wasn't finished. "Honestly, I don't regret a damn thing," she spat, her eyes sharp with defiance, the slurring fading. "We did it even when you were at home, behind your back. And you know what? It was some of the best sex I've ever had." Jason's body went numb, his chest tightened as he fought to breathe. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife, the woman he loved, the mother of his children, was mocking their marriage, boasting about her affair with his brother. "Amber, what the hell are you saying?" Jason's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Amber glanced at him briefly, showing no remorse. "You heard me," she said coldly. 5 years. And I'd do it again." Jason's hands trembled as he tried to stand. His legs felt weak, on the verge of collapse. His heart pounded, torn between anger and pain. Then Derek, still avoiding Jason's eyes, smirked, but it wasn't an apology or even regret. He slowly raised his phone, his thumb moving over the screen. "We even filmed ourselves," he said, his voice cracking slightly, but the smirk remained. Want to see Jason froze, his brain struggling to comprehend. It was like a nightmare unfolding. Everyone was watching, wide-eyed in disbelief. Derek wasn't bluffing. He tapped the screen, and suddenly, vulgar sounds filled the air. The family sat, stunned into silence. Jason's vision blurred with fury, every muscle tensed, fists clenched. His brother, the man he had trusted, was showing videos of his betrayal in front of everyone. Jason snapped, a tightly wound spring breaking. Without thinking, he lunged, pure rage driving him, his body moving faster than his mind. Before anyone could react, his hands were around Derek's collar. "You bastard," he screamed. The impact sent Derek crashing to the ground, the bonfire's crackle drowned by the pounding of blood in Jason's ears. "How could you?" Jason's voice was raw, his throat burning as the words erupted from deep within. He pinned Derek to the ground, the shock on Derek's face barely registered. Years of pent-up frustration, shattered trust, and betrayal exploded in one violent punch. Jason's fist met Derek's jaw with a sickening thud, echoing in the stunned silence. Derek groaned, weakly trying to push Jason away, but Jason's fury was unstoppable. He drew back his fist and hit Derek again, his knuckles splitting on impact. He didn't feel the pain, he didn't care. "Jason!" Stop, Grace shouted, rushing toward them, but Jason barely heard her, his vision blurred by rage, his pulse roaring in his ears. He shoved Derek again, the wood behind creaking under the force. "You disgusting snake," Jason roared, his voice shaking. "How could you do this to me? How could you betray me like this?" He grabbed Derek's shirt, lifting him slightly before slamming him back down with enough force to make the ground tremble. "You slept with my wife," Jason growled, his face inches from Derek's. "You ruined everything. You both did." Derek, dazed from the punches, weakly raised his hands to push Jason away. I'm sorry," he muttered, but the apology was empty, lacking sincerity. Jason heard the cowardice in his brother's voice. Amber stood a few feet away, her face pale, her earlier defiance gone. She didn't move to stop Jason or say a word. The family was paralyzed, some frozen in disbelief, others turning away, unable to watch. The fire crackled, mingling with muffled gasps, but no one intervened. Derek struggled beneath Jason, his lips split, blood trickling from his nose. He coughed, his voice barely a whisper, a mix of pain and panic. But Jason didn't care. This wasn't about Derek's suffering. It was about justice. A twisted form of payback for 5 years of deceit that had gone unnoticed. "I'll serve you karma, you hear me," Jason growled, his breath heavy. He raised his fist again, ready to strike, but Amber's voice pierced through his fury. "Jason, stop," she cried, stumbling toward them, her eyes wide with panic, her earlier bravado replaced by fear. She swayed, barely able to stand, her hands fumbling as she tried to approach. Jason turned slowly, glaring at her, his chest heaving. "You," he pointed at Amber, his hand shaking. "You did this. You destroyed everything." Amber stepped back, tears streaking her pale face. "I didn't," she began, but Jason cut her off. "Don't you dare try to explain this." He screamed, his voice breaking. "You think you can say sorry? You think this just goes away?" Amber covered her face, her shoulders shaking as the reality of her actions finally sank in. "Jason, please, I didn't mean," she began, but Jason cut her off, throwing his hands up in frustration. "You didn't mean what? To destroy our family? To throw away 10 years of marriage for this?" He gestured angrily at Derek, who was still on the ground, struggling to catch his breath. "I was drunk," Amber tried to explain, but her voice faltered, and she stumbled forward, reaching out toward Jason. Jason stepped back, his face twisted with disgust. "You think being drunk excuses this? 5 years, Amber. 5 years behind my back, with my own brother." His voice shook as the weight of the betrayal crushed him. He glanced at Derek, who was slowly sitting up, his face bruised and bloody. Jason inhaled deeply, trying to calm himself, but the fury inside him wouldn't let go. "You think this is over?" he growled, locking eyes with Derek. "You think a few punches make us even?" Derek winced, wiping blood from his mouth, but he couldn't find any words. The pain and guilt had silenced him. Jason grabbed Derek's shirt, pulling him halfway off the ground. "You ruined everything," Jason hissed through clenched teeth. "My marriage, our family, how could you do this? How could you sleep with her, knowing what it would do to me?" Derek's voice was hoarse as he tried to stammer an apology. "Jason," he started, but Jason cut him off. "Shut up," he roared, his face inches from Derek's. "You don't get to apologize. You don't get to make this right." Amber, still trembling, tried to approach again, her hand reaching out. "Jason, please." "Don't you dare touch me," Jason snarled, turning his blazing eyes on her. "You think you're innocent in this? You stood there, smiling, laughing, while you tore our lives apart." "I didn't." Amber's voice cracked, but Jason's glare silenced her. "You did this," Jason shouted, his voice breaking. "You threw away everything we had." For this he released Derek's shirt and stood, towering over them both, his fists still clenched, blood dripping from his knuckles, though he was too enraged to feel the pain. "You think your tears mean anything now?" Jason's voice was hollow as he looked down at Amber, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she cried out, her voice desperate. "Jason, please, I'm sorry, I didn't." "Stop," Jason interrupted, his voice suddenly calm, terrifyingly so. "Just stop." He turned to the rest of the family, who watched in horror, none of them moving to intervene. Jason took a deep breath, his body shaking as he struggled to keep control. "You think you two deserve each other," he muttered with disdain, glancing at Derek, who had managed to sit up, cradling his bleeding face. "You've ruined everything, and you don't even care." Jason walked away, his fists still trembling, his heart pounding. He didn't know where he was headed or what he would do next. All he knew was that everything he had built, everything he had loved, had been destroyed in one night of betrayal, and there was no fixing it, only the cold, harsh truth of what his life had become. The cold night air stung Jason's face as he sped down the highway, headlights blurring through his tear-filled eyes. The reunion was now a distant nightmare, but the anger still boiled inside him, pushing him towards something darker. His mind raced as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely audible in the silent car. "I'll make them pay for everything." The memory of Amber's mocking laughter, her cruel words in front of their family, made his stomach churn. And Derek, his own brother, playing those videos like it was some twisted joke. Jason's heart pounded harder, each beat echoing the same thought: revenge. He pulled into a quiet rest stop, slamming the car door behind him. The cold wind bit at his skin as he paced around the empty lot, his breath coming in harsh, ragged bursts. He wasn't thinking rationally anymore. Reconciliation or moving on wasn't on his mind. He wanted them both to suffer, to destroy them the way they had destroyed him. How could they do this? How could they betray me like that? Jason took out his phone, staring at it for a long moment as an idea formed, sharp and clear amidst his anger. He wasn't just going to hurt them, he was going to dismantle their entire lives, piece by piece. The first call he made was to his lawyer. He wasn't going to let Amber walk away with any of his hard-earned money, not a single cent. "Jason, it's late. What's going on?" His lawyer, Bill, answered groggily. "I need to start divorce proceedings immediately," Jason said, his voice cold and controlled. "I want her to get nothing. Absolutely nothing." Bill hesitated on the other end. "Jason, slow down. What happened?" "She cheated on me," Jason growled. "For 5 years, with my brother. I want her out of my life, and I don't want her walking away with anything. Can you make that happen?" There was a pause, then Bill's voice softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jason. We can start the process, but these things take time. You'll need evidence." "Don't worry about that," Jason said. "I've got all the evidence I need." The next part of Jason's plan involved digging deep into Derek's life. Jason knew Derek had always stored his personal videos and files in the cloud, a fact that had been more of a sibling joke in the past. But now, that carelessness was about to be his downfall. Jason wasn't a tech expert, but he knew enough. After hours of sifting through old emails and online accounts, he found a way into Derek's cloud storage. His stomach twisted as he began downloading the files, his heart pounding as each video appeared on his screen. It wasn't just Amber. Derek had been careless, recording intimate moments with multiple women, some of whom they both knew. As Jason watched, a strange sense of detachment washed over him. It felt like watching the last remnants of his old life disintegrate before his eyes. Each file he downloaded fueled his rage, but it also gave him something: he craved control. With these videos, he could ruin Derek's relationships, his career, his entire life. "I'll burn everything down," Jason muttered, leaning back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the screen. "They'll regret ever crossing me." But just having the videos wasn't enough. Jason wanted the fallout to be public, to see the humiliation on their faces when everyone knew the truth. He wasn't going to let them off easily. The first email went out the next morning, sent anonymously to a few select members of their extended family. Jason was fully aware that his actions would spark rumors, but that was just the start. As he hit send, he pictured the shock, the whispers, and the slow crumbling of his brother's flawless facade. By afternoon, messages started pouring in. One cousin sent him a screenshot of the circulating email with a simple "Jason, have you seen this?" Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was biding his time for the real chaos to begin. As days went by, the rumors intensified, and his phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from relatives and friends, some worried, some nosy, but all stunned, Although the videos hadn't yet gone viral, it was only a matter of time. Jason had deliberately sent them to people who couldn't keep a secret if their lives depended on it. However, despite the spreading whispers, Jason remained unsatisfied. He wanted more. He wanted them both to suffer in public, beyond the tight-knit circles of their family and friends. A week later, Jason made his next move, creating an anonymous online profile to post the videos on platforms that would attract attention. He carefully blurred faces and kept details vague enough to avoid direct links to himself, at least for now. But the damage was already done. Derek's phone blew up as his colleagues found out, and it quickly escalated beyond family gossip. His professional reputation was in ruins. People whispered behind his back, and his boss called him in to address the rumors. Derek denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. Amber wasn't faring any better. Her humiliation from having her affair exposed within their social circle was unbearable. She stopped going out, and her friends stopped answering her calls, leaving her suffocating under the weight of her lies. For Jason, though, it still wasn't enough. Each time he saw their names pop up in a message or heard about the turmoil engulfing their lives, he felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it never lasted. The rage continued to simmer just beneath the surface, driving him to push further. One cold evening, Jason sat in his car parked outside Derek's apartment, watching as the lights flickered on inside. He knew Derek was home, likely trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of his life. Jason's phone buzzed again this time. A message from Amber. Jason, please, can we talk? I know I messed up. I'm sorry. Just please stop. Jason stared at the message for a long time, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. For the first time since the reunion, a wave of exhaustion swept over him, but it wasn't from lack of sleep. It felt deeper, as though his very soul had been drained. He didn't reply to Amber's plea. Instead, he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, letting the cold air seep into the car. Revenge had consumed him, but for the first time, he wondered what would remain of him when it was all over. Months passed, but the fury coursing through Jason showed no signs of easing. Each morning, he woke up with the same bitter taste in his mouth, the sting of betrayal as sharp as it had been that night at the family reunion. Amber and Derek's lives had continued to fall apart, just as Jason had intended. Their reputations were destroyed, they had been cut off by friends and family, and Derek had even lost his job. But despite achieving everything he had set out to do, Jason found no comfort. Instead, he was drowning in his own resentment, unable to escape it. He had cut ties with nearly everyone, including those who had tried to help. His friends could no longer reach him, and his parents had stopped calling, unable to watch their sons spiral further into despair. Jason rarely left his apartment, his world shrinking into a grim routine of work, drinking, and endless rage-filled thoughts. One bleak evening, after downing several glasses of whiskey, Jason stared at the empty bottles scattered on his kitchen table. His mind drifted back to Derek and Amber, and a familiar anger flared up inside him, more intense than ever. He needed to confront Derek, to look him in the eye one last time. Driven by alcohol and a desperate need for closure, Jason grabbed his car keys and stormed out the door. He sped through the city towards Derek's apartment, barely registering the stoplights and turns, his focus singular. Derek's apartment was modest, a far cry from the confident, carefree man who once boasted about his easygoing life. As Jason approached, the windows were dark, but he knew Derek was inside. He pounded on the door, fists hammering against the wood until he heard the shuffling of footsteps from within. The door creaked open slightly, revealing Derek's pale and exhausted face. He blinked in confusion, clearly not expecting his brother. "What the hell?" Derek mumbled, squinting against the bright hallway light. He reeked of alcohol, and behind him, the apartment was a chaotic mess of empty bottles and clothes scattered everywhere. His life was in shambles, but Jason didn't care. "You ruined everything," Jason shouted, his voice raw with anger as he shoved the door open and barged inside. Before Derek could react, he stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock. "What are you talking about?" "I've already lost everything, Jason. What more do you want?" Jason's fists clenched tightly. "You think losing your job and a few friends makes up for what you did? You destroyed my marriage, my life, and you think you can just keep living like nothing happened?" He stepped closer, looming over Derek, who backed away, fear tightening his features. "Jason, I'm sorry, okay? I never meant for it to get this far. I messed up. We both did. But this isn't going to fix anything." Derek's voice wavered, filled with desperation, but it did nothing to quell Jason's fury. "No," Jason hissed, his face inches from Derek's. "It's too late for sorry. You took everything from me, and now you're going to pay. Jason's hands shot out, grabbing Derek by the throat. The rush of power and the thirst for revenge consumed him as he squeezed, watching Derek gasp and claw at his wrists, struggling to break free. You think you can wreck my life and just walk away? Jason's voice was low, trembling with rage. Derek tried to speak, but no words came out. His face reddened, eyes bulging with panic. In that instant, something snapped in Jason. The years of bottled-up anger were no longer just words, they were actions fueled by hatred that felt unstoppable. Derek's legs buckled beneath him as he tried to escape Jason's grip, flailing and stumbling backward. In a horrifying moment, Jason shoved harder. Derek's body twisted awkwardly as he fell, his head striking the sharp edge of the coffee table. The sickening crack echoed through the room. Time seemed to freeze as Jason stood paralyzed, his breath catching in his throat. Derek lay on the floor, unmoving, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood began to pool around him, dark and sickening on the carpet. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, the reality of what had just happened crashing down on him. He took a step back, his hands trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. "No, no, no," Jason whispered, stumbling back as panic gripped him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had wanted revenge, but not like this, not this. He knelt beside Derek, his hands hovering over his brother's still body, unsure of what to do. Derek's chest didn't rise or fall, his eyes stared blankly ahead. Derek, Jason's voice broke as he shook his brother's shoulders, but there was no response. The suffocating silence in the room was broken only by Jason's ragged breathing. A faint voice echoed in his ears. Was it a neighbor? Jason couldn't tell. All he could focus on was the horror before him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but nothing fit. This wasn't supposed to happen. Minutes later, the police arrived, sirens piercing the night. A neighbor had heard the commotion and called 911, but it was too late. Officers stormed into the apartment, finding Jason kneeling beside Derek's body, blood on his hands. "Stand up, hands where we can see them," one officer shouted, gun drawn. Jason didn't resist, he didn't move. His mind was blank, his body weighed down by what he had done. Slowly he stood, his hands raised in surrender. The officers moved swiftly, cuffing him and reading his rights, but Jason didn't hear a word. His world had shattered, and there was no going back. As they let him out, Jason caught a final glimpse of Derek's lifeless body. The hatred that had driven him for so long was gone, replaced by an empty void. He had sought revenge, and in the end, it had cost him everything. Amber sat alone in her apartment, the news of Derek's death hitting her like a blow. She had lost it all, her marriage, her dignity, and now her lover. She wept quietly, realizing too late the price of her betrayal. Jason had lost everything, but so had she.